not affect Lesotho, but affects many other, obviously, coastal areas, is sea level rise. So that's the kind of thing that you would see in the first order level. And it's the kind of climate change that we don't have control over. At a second order level, that then has impacts on land systems, water systems, and could have impacts on extreme events. That then in turn at a third order level will have impacts on economic productivity and livelihood sustenance. So it will impact on agriculture productivity, for example, and also on various kinds of land uses, could impact on tourism. And then in turn, that can bring impacts for food security and human security, as well as for poverty. So that's what we would call a fourth order level of impact. So as you cascade through how impacts of climate change work, you start getting down to the nitty-gritty where climate change really affects people and the systems that people live within. Please go to the next slide. So colleagues, with that climate science in mind, the global finance, climate finance architecture has evolved. It can look very complicated. We've tried to simplify it for you here in this module, but there are various forms of climate finance that are there to address all the issues that I raised in the previous slide. So the overarching framework is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and its latest legal instrument is the Paris Agreement, which has been ratified and was concluded in 2015 in Paris, which is why it was called that. That, colleagues, was also the year that the Sustainable Development 2030 Agenda was concluded. So the Paris Agreement happened in December 2015, and the Sustainable Development Goals were concluded and signed off in September preceding the Paris Agreement. These are some key UN instruments. Those of you that are a little bit older and have been involved in the climate change space for some time will remember that the first legal instrument that was ever concluded under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, was the Kyoto Protocol. And the Kyoto Protocol specifically set out to curb greenhouse gas emissions. And it had a number of financial instruments that emerged from it. The Paris Agreement took things much further. By the time we got to Paris in 2015, we'd all learned a lot more from the science. And it was clear that curbing greenhouse gas emissions is important. We do need to limit global warming to 2 degrees, which is the sort of legal goal in the Paris Agreement, but it's also got a target of 1.5 degrees maximum temperature increase. And that Paris Agreement also recognized that we may not reach that target. And therefore we have to adapt to climate change. And this is particularly important in Lesotho, where you are suffering the impacts of what other countries are doing or not doing in terms of curbing greenhouse gas emissions. Lesotho is not a major greenhouse gas emitter. But so emanating from the UNFCCC are a number of financing mechanisms. Global financing mechanisms are the ones in the second block. These include the Green Climate Fund, which was agreed in 2010, and the rules were agreed in 2011 in the Durban climate negotiations. And it has a board, it has a mandate. This has evolved over time. The main thing that sort of drove the rules of the Green Climate Fund was that it's different to the Global Environment Fund and the Climate Investment Funds that are housed under the World Bank, in that it's not administered under World Bank administration and rules. So it has its own institutional framework, which has been a good thing, but it's also brought its challenges. You will be going through some of those as we do this course. The Adaptation Fund actually emerged out of Kyoto Protocol, interestingly, in its later years, where a percentage of carbon finance was channeled to climate change adaptation. Also, colleagues, in recognition of the fact that curbing greenhouse gas emissions is not enough for countries like Lesotho, where adaptation is critical. Then there's also the Least Developed Countries Fund, and Lesotho is a least developed country, an LDC. And this fund has funded things like national adaptation plans, etc. And Lesotho has been a recipient of some of these funds. And then there are countries that contribute both to those funds that I have mentioned, because the money has to come from somewhere, and then they also disperse bilateral, what we call bilateral climate finance, in other words, between two countries. So that's the bottom block, and the third block are talking about the contributing countries. And they're often the big sort of donor countries like the UK. So DFID and UK8 have been a major funder and are a major contributor to the GCF, the JEF, etc. USAID is another, and then there are a number of countries that make significant contributions. Colleagues, we also have non-UNFCCC mechanisms, but also which fall within the UN system or the multilateral development finance system. So these include United Nations Development Programme, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Bank plays a key role, the African Development Bank on this continent plays a key role. And so these are also important financiers. They're not all named here. Recipient countries in the global climate finance architecture, we've seen an increasing trend over the last decade, I would say, towards what is known as direct access modality. In other words, that countries are able to access funds from the multilateral funds directly, but because of the strong governance arrangements that are needed, and monitoring of governance, there are some very strong rules in place around how those direct access modalities work. So, for example, and this is where the NDA, so the National Designated Authority in Lesotho that I spoke about right at the beginning, is part of that direct access modality. Flowing from there are accredited entities who are the ones that actually receive the funds, and then they in turn appoint national executing agencies. They can also be international, and those will help the accredited entity implement the project or program concerned. This kind of detail we will go into in the course because it's important understanding for readiness. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there's bilateral climate finance. So colleagues, climate finance readiness is really about capacitation. So it's getting a country ready to access the Green Climate Fund and to improve its access to other funds. And so what we're going through in this training course is part of that capacitation process. So what those national capacities need to comprise of is the ability to plan for climate finance. Now, colleagues, this is something that will be covered in the country program design, and you've got a forthcoming assignment on how to look at the country context for Lesotho's country program. And that really is about planning for finance. It's about setting the scene and understanding what Lesotho's needs are from climate finance and telling the world what those needs are, so that your agenda for climate finance is as clear to the international funders that you will rely on for financial support as it is to you. So there needs to be clarity of understanding of what your plans for climate finance are. And this is a big component of this training course. Another key aspect of readiness is accessing different forms and types of finance. At the national level, Lesotho has had some success in accessing climate finance. You're not starting from a zero base. The EU, for example, has been a significant investor in climate change initiatives in the country. And as a result, you have policies and strategies in place that come from that kind of support. A third key aspect is how to deliver finance and implement and execute a project or a program. in your climate finance sort of suite. And then last but not least is ongoing monitoring, reporting and verifying. What's come to be known in the jargon that sort of permeates across the climate finance space is come to be known as MRV. And colleagues, this is important. The international donors will refuse to continue to finance if they don't understand where the money is going, what it's doing, what impact it's having, and whether or not the money is actually being spent on climate change. So that monitoring, reporting and verification is an ongoing process. It needs to start at the beginning of a country program or a project and carry on after that the project finance has been concluded. One of the key things that you will hear about repeatedly through this training course is transformational change. It's one of the key investment criteria of the Green Climate Fund is they need to see transformative impacts. And basically, very simply put, what does that mean? It means that the world has recognized that development and business as usual cannot continue as business as usual because climate change has changed the game. So the way we've been approaching development, the way we've been doing planning, the way we've been budgeting, the way we've been spending money, the way we've been monitoring and reporting, all of those things have to change because of the impacts of climate change on development, which is how I started this particular module. So that focus on transformative change and being able to track your progress in Lesotho in that regard is really important. And colleagues, by way of an example, something that I've in various projects that we're doing in Lesotho, including this one, that I'm watching with interest is your integrated catchment management unit that has been set up. And it's been set up as a multi-stakeholder forum to manage integrated catchment management solutions in Lesotho because there's recognition that integrated catchment management is a critical solution. Mainstreaming climate change into that will be one of the means of achieving transformative impacts for Lesotho. We can go to the next slide. So colleagues, I touched earlier on what the Green Climate Fund Readiness project is about, as supported by the Development Bank of Southern Africa, which is a accredited entity to the GCF and therefore can support Lesotho in accessing climate finance. One of the main objectives of this project is to strengthen the NDA, which is Lesotho Meteorological Services Unit, who is your appointed NDA. So our job is to strengthen the NDA's capacities to work with the GCF and to work closely with the GCF on behalf of the Lesotho broader government and stakeholders. What this then means is that we work with the NDA and with the broader group of stakeholders to develop the strategic frameworks for GCF interaction and for the country program. So this project will culminate in a country program that is GCF ready. In other words, it aligns with GCF requirements of a country program and it captures all of Lesotho's key needs and climate impacts and its project priorities. A third aspect is to build institutional partnerships in Lesotho. And this is around making sure that there's a multi-stakeholder coordination mechanism for GCF planning and for implementing the country program that will be developed under this project. That multi-stakeholder coordination mechanism could dovetail with the integrated catchment management unit that I was talking about earlier, because that has been established now as a multi-stakeholder mechanism. So this is something we are looking at. Next slide. The Readiness project then further covers three key aspects. One is we look at the policy level. So what policies do you have in place in Lesotho? Do these align with your sector needs? Are you catering for private sector investment? Bearing in mind that the Green Climate Fund has got a private investor window or a private sector window, in addition to which you will need private sector investment, whether it's a small scale farmer simply investing in changing the way that he or she farms. In other words, for example, moving to conservation agriculture or improving grazing practices, that's an investment. Or if it's right at the high level of a mining operation or a commercial agriculture level firm investment, but private sector investment is a big component. Then there's the institutional level, which I've spoken about. So that multi-stakeholder coordination is critical, colleagues. The climate change impacts on every sector in Lesotho, really. And if you're going to get coherent impacts and maximum transformative impact changes, you will need to work across the different institutions and stakeholder groups. So there's a fair amount of emphasis on this. We're also looking at the implementation entities and fiduciary systems, public financial management systems that incorporate climate, and then the question of where would quality control, reporting and communications take place. A lot of that from a GCF perspective will be with your NDA. LMS. And then there's individual skills level, things like financial management, program formulation and management, and particularly monitoring and evaluation methods. So especially the second two of these are skills that we will be going through in this project. Next. In terms of Lesotho's climate finance landscape, I did indicate that you have been accessing climate finance already. This is not new. The kinds of donors that have been active in Lesotho are bilateral as well as multilateral. So they include the European Union, Irish Aid, the World Bank, which is a development finance institution, various UN agencies like UNDP and FAO. FAO has been very instrumental in some of the sort of agriculture baseline assessments, for example, in Lesotho. And then also USAID, African Development Bank that I mentioned earlier. Then the bilateral and multilateral climate funds are starting to become more active in Lesotho. So these are the Global Environment Fund, the GCF, which is the main topic of this course, the Adaptation Fund, and then the International Climate Investment Funds, although they have not been that active in Lesotho. So let's go to the next one. I think it's interesting to have a quick look at the way that these climate funds have flowed in Lesotho. So what sectors have been receiving finance? And what we've learned from the scoping work that we did on this project is that the most funded sector is water and sanitation. So that's if we measure by the number of projects, and there were 25 projects that we scoped in that sector. And then agriculture and food security is the next biggest sector. And obviously, colleagues, water and agriculture and food security go hand in hand. So, you know, one could be forgiven for looking at those as one sector because you won't have food security if you don't have enough water to enable that. Then there are sectors that receive minimal funding, although this is starting to change. Land degradation, organic pollutants, disaster risk management, and chemicals and waste are among the sectors that are typically financed under climate finance globally, but are not necessarily manifesting in Lesotho. The one that is shifting here is land degradation. So we for example, are doing an investment plan for the Renoka program, which is the Olive River approach in Lesotho, and that's with the Integrated Catchment Management Unit, and one of its key focuses is looking at land degradation, but then also water investments, among others. So colleagues, the table at the bottom, it's in your course notes and just gives you the overview of the number of projects that have come from donors, from climate funds into Lesotho. And you can see that the donors kind of dominate. In other words, that's mainly bilateral finance. You know, it's money between DFID and Lesotho, for example, or UK Aid and Lesotho. So that's where most of your finance is coming from. The climate funds, like the Global Environment Fund, are investing in biodiversity, which obviously also impacts land degradation. So that's important, and you can see it from the numbers. And then there's been, as I mentioned earlier, a fair amount of support for climate change policies, strategies and plans, as well as for capacity building, as a result of which you do have a suite of policies that you can work with, which is great. And those come from places like the European Union, as I mentioned earlier, as well as the climate funds. If we can go to the next slide. All right, and then colleagues, just to give a little bit more detail on some of the things we've spoken about. So in terms of financial planning, what you have in Lesotho, and this is an indication of the level of readiness that you already have, you're not, as I keep saying, starting from zero base, is financial planning. So you've got your National Climate Change Policy, which runs from 2017 to 2027. So that'll be an important policy for the country context in your country program. You've got the Scaling Renewable Energy Program. You've got a National Climate Change Committee, which is a multi-stakeholder driven platform. It does have a limited mandate. So we are looking at these institutional arrangements to see where they can be strengthened. And any colleagues that have thoughts on that, please post them in the chat room or raise them in the discussion just now. And then within that, a subcommittee on climate finance readiness. In terms of accessing finance, as we've mentioned, the National Designated Authority has been appointed. So this does increase your readiness. The GCF will not operate with a country that does not have an NDA. So it's a basic requirement. And then you are increasingly looking at accessing funds from the global funds that we've mentioned. Accreditation of national entities is something that may come in the future. Colleagues, some countries in Africa have got national accredited entities, others don't. And the ones that don't, and there are many that don't, they use the multilateral accredited entities or the regional accredited entities. In your instance, you've got access to a range of both multilateral accredited entities and regional. So regional is the Development Bank of Southern Africa, which has a mandate across the region. So it has a mandate to support Lesotho, and it is supporting this readiness program. But then you've got international accredited entities as well at your disposal, like UNDP and UNEP. Both of those are the World Food Programme. FAO is a multilateral accredited entity. IUCN is a multilateral accredited entity. These are all institutions that operate in Lesotho. So even though you don't have a national accredited entity, and I think it'll take you some time before you can do that, because it's a very rigorous process to go through with the GCF, you've got accredited entities at your disposal. So you can access the Green Climate Fund. In terms of this readiness project, as I've already mentioned, we'll be focusing, or we are already focusing on institutional capacity development, the development of Lesotho's country program, that will be a product of this project, and then your monitoring and reporting frameworks. Lesotho does have a number of challenges, one of which is you don't have dedicated finance mechanisms. And I think within this, the main issue is probably domestic sources of climate finance through your national budget allocation. So this is something you will need to work on going forward. National budget allocations are a function of mainstreaming climate change. And that's what I was talking about earlier in terms of transformative impacts. Let's go on. And then just continuing with your readiness status and what we'll be exploring, we're looking at delivering finance. So just going back to those 4 bullet points I was talking about earlier. The role of the development banks is something we're exploring, as is interest from the private sector. So our sense so far from our scoping work is that the private sector, I'm not sure that interest is necessarily the right word, but let's say they're not engaged heavily in the climate finance space. And I think this is something that needs to be integrated into the country program so that the private sector is among those that clearly understand what your agenda is for climate finance. So it will also then drive that country program, including, locating the private sector, will then drive your coordination between public and private sector and also between different stakeholders. One of the aspects we'll be looking at in this project is monitoring and reporting and verification, and M&E systems and MRV systems still need to be established. So colleagues, the bottom icon just shows you that you've made progress in some areas. You're not starting from a zero base, but there is some work to be done, and our training program with you is structured around primarily where that work is needed. Let's go to the next. Colleagues, there are a number of barriers to accessing climate finance. These exist across Africa, but for here we focused on what's really needed in Lesotho. So one thing we've observed through the survey workshop and the consultations is that there's limited technical capacities for mobilizing climate finance. And I would add to that there's limited human capacities. In other words, it's both a technical knowledge issue and the number of resources that are actually available in a given department. So the priority here is to build capacity to develop bankable projects and climate change related interventions, etc., that will attract foreign climate finance. Then a second issue that I've already highlighted, although I think there's been progress in Lesotho, is weak coordination mechanisms and legal frameworks. So this we particularly picked up in the scoping report that we did for this project last year. And it will be necessary to develop enabling frameworks and an enabling environment that can support climate finance and support de-risking of climate finance in the private sector. Private sector is very risk averse. They look at everything in terms of how they spend as a potential risk, and therefore they're always looking at mitigating the risk. If you want to work with the private sector in climate change and climate finance, you have to help them understand how they can de-risk their investment. And that requires a fairly significant level of coordination, as well as very specific legal, regulatory, and institutional arrangements that can drive that coordination. We have learned that there are fairly low levels of awareness, you said this in the survey quite loudly, of climate change and particularly of its impacts, and even more particularly in terms of what to do about it. And so it'll be a priority to establish and implement robust stakeholder engagement processes. We did do a stakeholder process in January, and we are planning to come back in a month or two's time to run one of these modules and to do some more intense stakeholder engagement in person, with a view to dealing or addressing many of the readiness needs I've talked about, but also to increase the levels of awareness. And colleagues, we need you to help us understand how best you can make use of the One World team in our support to you that runs until the end of this year, so until the end of 2022. So please do keep in touch with us. Let us know where your particular gaps are. We did cover them in the survey, we think fairly comprehensively, but there's always more to learn. And then lastly is the dedicated financing mechanisms. Colleagues, we've talked here about a fund because this keeps getting talked about in the international community. I'm not convinced that this is necessary. A national climate change fund, I think, can burden Lesotho. And so I want to talk about it in that sense. The African Development Bank is playing an enormously useful role on the continent, and it's accessing GCF money, as is the DBSA, to set up specific programs and financial support mechanisms to the countries. And if it were me in your decision-making shoes, I would leave it at that. Running a climate change is fraught with challenges. We saw two set up in Bangladesh, and neither of them worked. There shouldn't have been two in the first place, but neither of them worked, and this was many years ago. So I would rather encourage you to to work with the finance institutions that I've spoken about, like the DBSA, to finance your climate change programs, to make sure they understand your needs in Lesotho so that they can also integrate those needs into their financing programs insofar as their mandates allow them to do so. Let's go to the next slide. Colleagues, there are some key finance opportunities and areas for investment that are critical in Lesotho, which we learned from the survey and the scoping work that we did. A big one is capacity building, which is why we are running this training course, as well as awareness raising. And in a way, those go together. But there is also broader stakeholder awareness raising that we need to think about quite carefully through this project. And we're also looking for your insights as to how best to raise awareness among households, community members and farmers in Lesotho, people that are on the ground, that are practicing practices that are maybe contradictory to what is required under a climate changing environment, like the land degradation I was talking about earlier. The integrated catchment management I've spoken about, that's critical. It does address key interrelated environmental challenges in Lesotho, like land degradation, water, farming practices, etc. And it has established this multi-stakeholder unit that the Lesotho people seem to have a significant amount of confidence in. The GCF Readiness project is an investment area and is here, as we've said already, here to address multiple challenges. And then there are a number of parallel initiatives that are ongoing. Part of the One World value add is that we are working on these other initiatives as well. So we are able to cross-populate insights from the different projects. I spoke about the Renoka investment plan that we are busy with at the moment. That will be concluded in October. And then that's being done under the broader GIZ program of support to the integrated catchment management process and to the unit in Lesotho. Next, please. So colleagues, I'm now going to talk a little bit about the country program. And just in case you didn't hear me earlier or you've forgotten something that I said, this will be a key output of this work. And you will be helping the NDA and One World to put the country program together. In other words, we're trying to build ownership of the country program across a broad group of stakeholders and use this training course opportunity as a co-development opportunity. And I'm saying this because you will have a forthcoming assignment. I was looking at it on Wednesday that will start this process, and further assignments will do the same. So you will be through this training course working on the country program, learning about what a country program is about. And we've got a wonderful case study that we're using, which is from Rwanda. So it's lovely that it's in Africa. It's one of the best country programs that have ever been submitted to the GCF. So of course, Africa is very proud to have that benchmark. And obviously our objective is for Lesotho to develop a country program that stands up against that standard very well. So the components of a country program, and this is very clear, I think it's a resource material in your modules. The GCF published in 2020, in March or April 2020, they finally launched their country program guidelines. And these are a summary of those guidelines. So they want to see a country context, which is the focus of this module. They want to see climate finance strategy and priorities. So what is Lesotho's climate finance strategy and what are your priorities? And within that, identification of project and program priorities for the GCF. So this is part of what we'll be doing with you later on in the year, is identifying those projects and programs that are your biggest priorities for climate investment in Lesotho. And the GCF prefers to see between 3 and 5. So it's not a lot of projects. So we really do need to think hard about what those priorities are. They want to know in the country program how your strategy and priorities is located within your policy framework. So that would be your climate change policy, but also your different sector policies. and that it addresses planning and institutional needs. And lastly, but not least, that it's been underpinned by a robust multi-stakeholder engagement process. The GCF are rigorous about this. We've done a lot of work with them, and one of the things we always notice that they scrutinize is who engaged, was it gender balanced, were the youth represented, were all the different sectors represented, were the most vulnerable people in this particular country or area represented. So that multi-stakeholder engagement process is absolutely central, hence my saying last but not least. So colleagues, the first part, as you saw from the previous slide, is the country context. So just to elaborate a little bit more on what this is about, and please do use this opportunity of being with us today to sort of listen carefully and interrogate us if you don't understand what we're talking about here, because this is your first assignment. So on this course. So the country context, colleagues, establishes in the country program I'm talking about, it establishes the country's climate change and sustainable development context, sustainable development including the socioeconomic context, as the basis for climate finance needs and priorities. In other words, in this section, you will talk about what are Lesotho's biggest climate change impacts, like rainfall variability is one of them. How does that impact on the socioeconomic and sustainable development context in Lesotho, and specifically in what way? So it's some of the things we've already mentioned, like the interactions with existing land degradation, which is originally not driven by climate change, originally driven by human activity primarily. But climate change has come along and is exacerbating that. And so that makes it a big priority. So if you have changes in rainfall variability that bring about an increase, for example, in floods or droughts, that will impact on land degradation and degrade the land further. So climate change, or degraded land rather, that's degraded because of overgrazing or poor crop rotation and crop management, but particularly overgrazing in the context of Lesotho. If you've got that situation and you've got a heavy drought and a series of heavy droughts, the land is not resilient enough because of the overgrazing in that example to be able to cope with the drought. So it's that kind of context that needs to go into that section. The second bullet talks about country ownership. This is a very important investment criteria for the GCF. It's one of its 6 primary investment criteria. It wants the country to show how country ownership is embedded in your climate finance agenda for the GCF. And colleagues, the way you do this is through your policy framework. So you link the climate change and sustainable development context back to the relevant policies. So you've got a policy for climate change, you've got poverty alleviation strategies, etc., that would come to bear. We've just got a little bit of a technical glitch that we, in terms of screen sharing, so we're just getting the slides back up. But colleagues, just to make sure that you understand that the link between country ownership and the context and what your priorities are needs to be extremely clear. And the best way, in fact, the only way of demonstrating that there is national ownership is to frame ownership through your policy framework, because those policies have been endorsed, they've been accepted. Can you go to the slide? They've been accepted by cabinet, so it's a very clear way of demonstrating country ownership. You can also base your country ownership on national strategies and planning documents. For example, those developed in the UNFCCC processes like a national adaptation plan or strategy. So that's another way of demonstrating ownership. But national policy is critical, and it's got to be an instrument that has been signed off by stakeholders and by government. So it has to be an official instrument to be able to demonstrate country ownership. And then, colleagues, your country context needs to focus on how the GCF can add value with its finance to your climate change needs in the context of your climate change and development country context. That is the first bullet point. Let's go to the next slide, please. The country context in Lesotho can come from the Sustainable Development Agenda. So this is just by way of, colleagues, this slide is by way of giving you examples of where you can draw the country context information from. So information from these examples can feed into your country program. So there are indicators, for example, your national gross development product, your growth rates, your Gini coefficient per capita, your human development index indicators, and there will be sectoral factors. The development prospects, so there are development plans, usually integrated development plans. Sorry, I'm finding this distracting. Thanks. There are integrated development plans, etc., that you can draw on that outline where Lesotho sees its development coming from at a macroeconomic level as well as at a local level. And also you've got documents that set out your fiscal circumstances and your strategies. So national budgets that align with national development plans, for example. As I mentioned earlier, there are poverty reduction and sustainable development strategies, social inclusion and gender mainstreaming strategies. These are among the different strategies that exist. And then you've also got key sector policy strategies. These are critical, colleagues. You know, anything around integrated catchment management, anything around climate resilient agriculture, anything that you have sector-wise around water resource development for water security under a changing climate environment, anything around green growth, renewable energy, all of those kinds of strategies and policies that contribute to your overarching sustainable development agenda are important. And then, colleagues, you also have climate change specific profiling and information that you need to have available. The GCF is very, very strong on climate change data. One of the reasons we were excited that the NDA is the Lesotho Meteorological Services unit or agency is because they've got some of your best data at their fingertips on what's been happening in terms of rainfall trends or temperature increases, etc., in Lesotho. And that kind of local data, as well as international data, for example, from the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, will be very important to informing your country program and the country context. So you do need to know what your projections for climate change are, where your vulnerabilities to climate change impacts lie under different climate change scenarios and within the context of greenhouse gas emissions. I think what's particularly important for Lesotho is understanding your adaptation needs, and then to a lesser extent also your mitigation potential. Your mitigation potential is likely to primarily come from energy emissions, and the way that you can address those is through renewable energy as well as through transport. The climate change profile also needs to identify the synergies between resilient recovery efforts and sustainable development objectives, as well as the climate change risks. In other words, you need to link your resilience agenda, your sustainable development agenda, and your growth agenda with climate change risks and opportunities. And those links have to be extremely clear for the GCF to accept a country program or a project. So the resolution of this kind of rationale gets much stronger in a project proposal compared to your country program, which will set a more high-level scene that your project proposals will then draw from and intensify in terms of detail. The potential adaptation and mitigation and resilience building climate change investment opportunities then need to show alignment. And this goes back to the country ownership issue with key instruments such as your nationally determined contribution to the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, your national adaptation plans, and any other long-term national strategies that are relevant. Please go to the next slide. So colleagues, we're now coming to your part of the workshop. I've spoken to you for long enough. Please will you use the raise hand function to let us know what questions you have. And I'm also going to have a look and see if there's anything in the chat room. And Hilary, will you help me monitor hands? And colleagues, some of you have introduced yourself in the chat room, I think everybody, so thank you for that. But colleagues, are there any questions or comments on the country context? Is there anything important that you feel we need to elaborate more? Please do feel free to raise your hand and ask. This is a very quiet room. It's probably the quietest I've ever seen. Yes. All right. Is that Malabani? Malabani, please go ahead.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. It's actually a request about assignment 1.
Sorry, Malabani, can you speak closer to your microphone? We're struggling to hear you.
Am I audible now?
That's better, thank you.
Yes, it is actually a request, not a question, about assignment 1. Can we have it in our classroom written down?
Can you have it in your classroom now? Sorry, can you explain, Malabani?
Isn't it? Yeah, you talked of assignment 1. We are going to have our assignment 1. So I am requesting that can you post it in our classroom so that we could understand and really go through it?
So assignment 1 is currently only been sent to the NBA participants.
Oh, I see. But that includes the country context.
Yes.
I think we should give it to all of the participants. Yeah. Yes, we can do that, Malabani. It's the reason you don't have it is because it was sent to the NDA participants only, but I think it would be useful for a broader stakeholder group. So we will post it and we will email it out to this group after this workshop. Thank you for that request. That's helpful. Taliso, and I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly. Please go ahead, Taliso.
Thank you. You know, in our language, the L is pronounced as a D. So it's TD. So thank you. My name is Tidiso Nchike from World Vision Lesotho. Thank you for a good presentation. It really gives a comprehensive background on the country context. I think we've had pieces of data coming in from different sources, but to have it as a holistic an overview of the context and where we are in the country is quite helpful. I just want to know if from the past projects and support we've been receiving as a country, are we progressing at least to this far? And are there measures? I understand there are gaps in coordination, but at least for individual projects, are there measures that are in place which are effective in terms of measuring our progress? Because these are key questions when we come to funding. We would want to reflect progress and that we have measures as a country which are most importantly coordinated. And yeah, those are my two questions, but I just want to have the last one. In terms of the buy-in and the commitment of the government, what has come out of the context analysis? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sadiso. So I'm going to just respond to each question as it comes up because I don't see many hands. So Sadiso, the question around progress, Lesotho has made some progress in terms of readiness. So as I said earlier, you have been accessing climate funds. You have put in place a climate change policy. There has been some integration of climate change into other sector plans. I know the Integrated Catchment Management Unit is considering climate change as a key driver and threat. As you said, I've already noted, the institutional coordination does need to be strengthened. So this is something we are working on in this project. The monitoring and reporting and verification process that I spoke of in the presentation, Sadiso, is something that we are developing as part of this project, and it'll allow you to track progress, including of the NDA, and increased transparency around reporting to stakeholders on what climate finance has been accessed and for what projects and how those projects are going. So that kind of mechanism is something that we are putting in. I'm not yet able to comment intensely on the question of political commitment or government commitment. We just haven't engaged enough in Lesotho to understand that properly yet. But I will say that the fact that the NDA has been endorsed and that requires, government approval, I think shows government commitment and participation and leadership in the process of accessing climate finance. So that for me is an important indicator, and I hope that helps. But I've never seen a country in Africa other than Rwanda and to some extent Ethiopia that political buy-in for climate change is strong enough. So those are the only two countries that we've really seen strong political buy-in. And so I would assume that there's still quite a lot of work and effort to be done in Lesotho to increase the political buy-in, as well as probably political awareness of climate change issues. And then I've got a hand from Kenisi. Kenisi, please go ahead, or is it Kenio? I might be pronouncing your name really badly. I can't see the screen properly. Kenio, please will you go ahead?
Well, thank you very much, Belinda, for a very informative presentation. I only have a request to make. Is it possible for you to share the scoping report with the participants? I think mine is just a request from us. Yes.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Neo. It's a good request. I thought it might come up. We will check with LMS that they are comfortable with us to share it, but I certainly don't see a problem. So we'll let you know very soon once we've chatted with LMS. If there's anyone from LMS with us that can give that approval, please let us know. But in the end, it's your document.
There are two questions.
Cabello, how are you? Please
Belinda.
go ahead.
Hello, good morning.
Morning.
I think you have answered it very well, because I think we'll have to talk it out with my director if we are ready to share the scoping report as of now, because I think it is still under the project. So maybe we will talk it over with our seniors if it's possible to share it now, but eventually it has to be available to people so that people can know the status and everything. But we'll talk it like Belinda has indicated. Thank you.
Thanks, Cabello. I thought you would say that. So colleagues, we will continue to liaise with the LMS. Cabello is from LMS and get the approval to share the report and be in touch with you around that.
2 questions in chat, both from Mponyani. The second one regards the course notes. So when you get to it, I'll bring it up on the screen.
The second regard?
A table in the course notes, which I'll put up on screen when you.
Okay, well, let's do it then.
This one is he's not clear on transformative impacts.
Oh, okay. All right. So, Mponyani, thanks for your 2 questions. We'll bring the table up in a minute, but I just want to talk about transformative impacts because this is important. So thanks for asking the question. Transformational change, I must say, I always find this hard to explain. So if I'm not getting it right, please ask me again and I will do it again. I don't mind. So colleagues, the concept of transformational impacts and change starts from the premise that the way that we've been conducting and planning for development needs to change because of climate change. So you can't, for example, in a sector policy for, say, water, plan for water resources that are not going to be available because climate change is bringing about increased droughts or reduced rainfall. So you would then have to reallocate in that example. So I'm going to give very specific examples to try and make this clear. In that example, you would need to look at your water allocation strategies and reconfigure how you do water allocation and water resource management planning because there's less available because of climate change. So the assumptions that we've always used as we plan for development, whether it's sector development or poverty alleviation, which is a cross-cutting issue, or gender mainstreaming, which is another cross-cutting issue, all of those kinds of development plans that have been going on for decades need to change fundamentally because of climate change. And that's transformational change. So the GCF measures transformative impacts by understanding the extent to which climate change has influenced changes in the policy environment, the planning frameworks, the budgeting frameworks. And that in turn is a transformative impact. And to take it down to the ground level, because that's the next level, right, is how does that then affect positively the most vulnerable communities? That would then need to say, so let's say you're planning for agriculture, your sector plan integrated the impacts of climate change on degraded land and therefore made budget available for spending on or investing in farmers so that they learn to farm differently, use water more conservatively, not overgraze, etc. And then that budget flow should then increase. Awareness, knowledge, skills, and practice change in those farming communities. And so you will have achieved through those examples that I've given transformative impacts at a sort of policy level that then cascade down to a farmer or a smallholder farmer level. And then you start seeing transformative impacts across the levels of government and governance and practice in Lesotho. Before I go to your next question, can you just let me know if that's an adequate answer, please, Mponyani? Please go ahead, Mponyani, sorry.
Oh. Yes, Belinda, I'm satisfied. You have answered my question. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much for clarifying. I'm going to go to your second question. So you asked about, and I'm just looking for it here, on the table 1.4, which Hillary's got up on the screen.
Why under...
Yeah, but I'm trying to read this. So you've asked under donor agencies, what does that mean? And that's the 0. Is that what she's asking?
Yes. Why is it 0 there?
So the 0 for organic pollutants is that it means that in our scoping, we didn't find any projects where donors have invested in that kind of intervention. So, and of course, our information might be out of date or we might not have scoped everything, but that was what we found in the scoping report. Do you understand otherwise, Mkhonyani?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yes, I understand now. I was thinking you were saying there were no donors for under that intervention.
Okay.
That
All right.
sector. I was thinking it meant there were no donors. Now I could understand the climate fund and the donors.
Yeah, so these numbers are, thanks for clarifying. Yeah, sorry to interrupt. So Mkhonyani, these numbers, I think you've understood now, they represent the number of projects in these different sector interventions. So I think we've clarified that. Thank you. Hilary, are there any more questions in the chat?
There's one chat from Diesel, and then there's one person who's unmuted, Mapesti.
All right, so Diso, you've said in the chat, in terms of financing coordination, at least for donors or development agencies, financing climate change in the country, is there a coordination framework informed by the country context and priorities? You do have a coordination framework. So there is, as I said earlier, the National Climate Change Committee. And then there's also more recently been the advent of the Integrated Catchment Management Unit, which is seen as a quite strong multi-stakeholder platform. So part of the work we will need to do through the rest of this year is to resolve with stakeholders what is the optimal or the best form of institutional coordination for Lesotho. So you do have some structures that we can work with, but we do need to resolve and make recommendations for what are the optimal institutional coordination platforms, because our observation is that these could be strengthened, as we said in the presentation. I hope that's help. I hope that does help. And we also note the point about a diagram. Thanks, Fidiso. You seem to be comfortable with that response. Colleagues, I don't see anything more in the chat room. Are there any more hands or comments from the floor? All right, I don't see any more hands or chats. So I'm going to start wrapping up, colleagues. And there is, as you know, a help desk. So you are free, if you think of something after the session today, you are free to raise your questions and we will try and help you. If you need support with the assignment, which I think, George, we're going to have to look at how we structure it because it's group work, right? Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about the assignment and then the next steps. So colleagues, there was a question or request earlier to share the assignment with everybody, and I'm quite keen to do that. We have discussed it before here at One World. Just to explain to you that it involves group work. So it's not an individually based assignment. You need to work together in groups, which you can do online or face-to-face, however you choose. And George will need to give some thought to how we structure those groups. Is there something you want to say about it?
Groups of 5.
Groups of 5.
Send that for participants from the NDA.
Yes.
So for the others to have.
Yeah. Their group, but everyone else.
So the NDA has got a group, as I said earlier, in response to the request. This assignment's gone to the NDA, so they've got a group. So NDA, please, Kabelo and colleagues, please carry on with your assignment. But hopefully by the end of today, we will structure people into groups of 5, and you will then work together on the assignment, and George will in the email make it clear as to what your timelines are for submission. So you will be working in groups of 5 on that assignment, and we will get that assignment out to you today with the groups, which we are going to select probably fairly randomly, and hopefully it'll build coordination and institutional cooperation in the process. So George, I would, if we can, look at cross-institutional groups on this. So that's an immediate next step. And then another next step, which can happen in parallel with the assignment, is we'll be launching the next module in the middle of next week on the online platform. So you will get the notifications from our course desk, and that will be launched next week. And colleagues, we've spaced the module, so there's 2 or 3 weeks in between each module, so that you've got time to, participate online and do the assignment work that is part of your overall mark for this course. So those are the immediate next steps. You will be seeing us again across, through the different modules, as I said at the beginning, either through these kinds of online webinar type platforms, but we're also wanting to come to Lesotho to do some of what we think is the more complex part of the training with you in Lesotho, in the room, where we can also work with you in your breakaway groups, like the breakaway groups for the assignments, to give you closer support. So we are wanting to do that as well. I'm going to pause there and see if there are any questions of clarification on what I've said. Otherwise, I'll just hand to Hilary and George to see if they've got any closing remarks. All right. So, colleagues, I'm not seeing any further comments or questions, either in the chat or on the group. So from my side, thank you. Thanks for your engagement today. Thanks for your excellent questions. It's always helpful for us to know where you need further elaboration, like the transformative impacts question, which is an important thing to understand. So thank you very much for your engagement. We're looking forward to your assignments. We're looking forward to seeing you in the next of these training sessions. And I'll just hand to either George or Hilary to see if there are any closing remarks on next steps. George? Nothing from you. Hilary?
We'll release the assignment and the groups very soon. And don't forget that you can always email me at helpdesk@oneworld.co.za. One World Group, sorry, I forgot to say. If you have any problems or questions, I'm here to help you. Thanks for coming, everybody.
All right, thanks everyone. I'm going to close the session now. Hope you have a lovely weekend.
Before you disappear, Belinda.
Cabello?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just making a remark that I think today this was necessary because only review material does not give a chance for people to express their questions and everything. So I think the session of today helped a lot because people were able to raise their concerns and the questions. So the clarifications were clear. And also I appreciate that you have decided to share the assignment with everyone so that they can have a full exposure of what NDA is experiencing. But we know that specifically it was meant for NDA. So I support that decision that now everyone will have an access to all the scope of work that we are doing. So I think this will help, like you have suggested that we are relying on the participants here to build a quality country program. So for them having all the material covering everything that the NDA is learning, it will make it easy for them to contribute on the build-up of a country program. So I appreciate that we have decided that with that, that's the way from LMS, I think, everyone.
Thanks very much, Cabello. And I was remiss because I should have asked LMS to make the closing remarks. So thank you for doing that. Dr. Moiti, I see your hand is up, but you do know that LMS has now made closing remarks. Dr. Moiti?
Yeah, I do appreciate that, but I also felt that In fact, what he mentioned is very important, but I also believe that even on their side, the whole issue of sharing the scoping report with the stakeholders it's important, because it is the stakeholders who are going to help them in doing what they are doing. So I just felt that it was important to emphasize that their participation here is quite crucial, that they understand and they know what has transpired, what information was found, because they actually have the information and can help even in terms of filling some of the gaps that may need to be filled. I thought I needed to make that observation.
Thanks, Dr. Moiti. I agree with you. So, Kabela, there's strong encouragement to get approval to circulate the scoping report. So we'll look forward to hearing from you on that. Thanks, Dr. Moiti. And Kabela, thank you for the closing remarks from LMS. I think they were encouraging and good feedback for the project team so that we can continue to do a good job. And we look forward to engaging with LMS further. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you very much.